useful for them. So that was her care. Now, some of the things that really struck me in anecdotal things I heard, when Noreen talked about the hard times in the 30s and 40s, and there was extreme poverty. Nobody had money. The economic war had left us in a very, very poor state. And things we take for granted today were just not givens. For instance, when you applied for the old age pension, it seems it was means tested. And if you had so many hens, that was considered against you. And the people often kept hens that were old. They weren't laying eggs, but they fed them, and they were taken as part of their income. So that was one of the things she would fight very strongly for, because the people had these hens, they weren't providing them with income, and they were being judged as income. So she would say they shouldn't consider these at all. That was a big thing. Even though it might look ridiculous in today's world, it wasn't ridiculous then. A story I heard is, we take pensions for granted now. But this woman, her husband died, he was a guard, up near the Donegal-Sligo border. She cycled the whole way down to Ballinamore. She had not got a pension. Her husband died quite suddenly. He was a guard, as I said. She had no pension. And she came down to ask my grandmother, was there any possibility that that pension could be hurried up? They literally had nothing to live on. So she fed the woman. I mean, how many miles did she cycle? She fed her, and she gave her food to bring home to the children. So these were it's just an indication of care, concern, and genuine charity for people in terms of love and care. There was one other thing which we would take for granted today. There was a young woman who had a child, and my grandmother went to Carrick-on-Shannon to see if she could get some money for this child, for the young woman, really. The man who was in charge of the funds, or the purse, was very harsh, and he was very hard on her. And she came out with tears in her eyes to my mother, who was waiting outside. And she said, I have got some money for that girl, but she said the man treated me as if I were the one who were having the child, and I just hate to think of what he might have said to her. And that's in the 30s and 40s, when people had absolutely nothing. So I just give that as a kind of an idea of what poverty was like in those days. Another man arrived on Christmas Day looking for something. He didn't even know it was Christmas Day. And they gave him his Christmas dinner. Wherever he came from, he probably didn't go to church or meeting house or anything. And he just came down. He had not a clue what it was. And he was absolutely poverty-stricken. So they're just kind of anecdotes of what life was like. The other side of her life was her great faith. And it's hard enough to lose your husband. But after that, there was a court case. Now, my grandmother was a very self-effacing woman. And there was a court case because of the death of her husband. And she was grilled by the barristers on how to prepare for this court case. It was horrific in her eyes, and because she wasn't used to anything like this. And she went home every evening. I don't know how many days it lasted for. She went home to a hotel room in Dublin and cried because it was so horrific for her, the grueling she got in preparation for the court case. She lost her husband. Then in 1941, her eldest son Johnny went to the States after his matric, and because he was an American citizen by birth, he was conscripted because the Americans were thinking of going into the Second World War. Now, they weren't committed to it at that stage. And he was on the weather ship. He joined the Navy, and he was on the weather ship in the Pacific. So he came home for a holiday or a break before they went to Honolulu and Pearl Harbor. And while he was in New York, he was shot. Now, her big concern, one thing, as I say, she was a lady of great faith. She was grateful he wasn't blown up in Pearl Harbor because his whole battalion was blown up in Pearl Harbor. So she was grateful for that. And the other thing was that a priest had anointed him. And I remember going with her and my mother up to Phibsborough because the priest who anointed him was Vincentian, and we went to Phibsborough to see if there was any possibility that they could locate that priest so that she could find out if he were conscious, if he had said anything, if he had left any message or anything, that just to put her mind at rest. It was the same with her husband. She worried, had he forgiven the man who shot him? And she, whether it's anecdotal or true, she was told that he said to the man when he walked over, he said, "Joe, lift me." And she found consolation in that because she believed he would have forgiven the man if he had asked him to lift him. So these are the things that were important for her, that in some way when people died they were at peace with their maker. And then Uncle Gerard, who was about 21, did agriculture in Warrenstown and then did horticulture and gardening in the Albert College and in Botanic Gardens, with a view to starting market gardening with Uncle Kevin, who was younger than he was, and he was still in Warrenstown. So he went to Cork to work, and while he was in Cork, he got sick. Granny came to my mother and she said, "Isn't it terrible that Gerard hasn't written, and it's most unlike him? He's 3 months down in Cork and I haven't heard anything." And then she got a letter from Father Cyprian Conifrey, who would be from round here, whose sister would have been married to one of the Kellys from Ardloher. And he wrote to her to say he had visited in the Mercy Hospital in Cork, and that there was a young man there who said he went round, he asked people, "Is there anything you need or anything I can do for you?" And he said, "I would love if you wrote to my mother." And he said, who was she? And he told him. And he said, "Certainly." He said, "I'm not able to write to her and she doesn't know I'm ill." And remember, we take phone calls, we take everything for granted, we take cars for granted. They weren't just par for the course then. So my grandmother went down to Cork, and her memory of Cork was that it was the hilliest city in Ireland. And when she was in Dublin, she walked everywhere. She walked to every hospital. As Mary said, she walked to all the offices. Everybody in the offices knew her because she went in personally about the people. And the hospitals, she walked to all the hospitals. So when she was in Cork, she walked everywhere there too. And they had medication. She had a friend. The Minister for Health actually was a friend of hers, and he went down to see was there anything they could do for Gerard, and they thought he had got a tubercular infection from a cow, so they had flown in an antibiotic from the States for him to see could they cure him. But my mother believes that he must have had brucellosis or something, and what they had given him really killed him. So he died at 21 He wasn't quite 22. So she had lost 2 sons and she had lost her husband. And in the middle of this, she was fighting elections and she was trying to be of service here in this constituency. But as a rural woman, she believed that we were all in this together. Everybody worked for each other. And remember, in the countryside at that time, mehels were par for the course. If you were saving your hay, people came in and helped you. If you were cutting turf, people came and helped you. Then they all had a barn dance and they got half a barrel of porter or Guinness or whatever, and they all had a great meal and they had a sing-song, and people relaxed together, enjoyed their time together, but they shared everything together. So it was never up and down, everybody was equal. And of all things that I would remember from Leitrim, is when I came here to visit, we used to walk out. As I say, she loved the countryside. And they had a little bit of land. When I say, I don't know how many acres, maybe 20, I don't even know, was it that big? And, excuse me, she used to go out there in the evening and I would walk with her. And we'd go out to see if there were any vegetables that we could have the next day for the dinner, if she were at home. And everybody here would always say, good evening to you both. Now, that was unheard of in Mullingar. Rarely would, they might say good evening, but nobody ever said good evening to you both. And I was so small, I used to think this was a great honour. Good evening to you both, that they greeted me as well. I just thought it was just lovely. It's so simple, but it meant a lot to me as a small child. And I would always, my memory of Leitrim would be that people were all very even. There was no up and down. It didn't matter who you were. You treated everybody else the same. And I suppose that to me is a very important value in the world we live in, where everybody now is judged on the amount of money they have, or the status they have, or the car they drive, or the house they live in. And really that's very superficial. What really matters that we're all the same, and if we're sick, it doesn't matter whether you're a pope or a pauper, you end up exactly the same. So I would just encourage you all, and for myself, it's one of the values I would like to have, is that we would treat everybody equally, and it's something I learned from my grandmother. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that very moving and vivid account of Mary's life and just the values, not just about the woman in her role as a political figure, but also about the woman herself and her generous nature, given, as you said, the circumstance of the time and just what her family was going through and so much loss and grief. Gosh, and I think this highlights why we need to hear the stories and that they be recorded, because it's about the social history of the time, as well as such a fantastic woman. I think there's a book in the making. Or is there a book already on?
No, we're working on it.
Oh, that's, that's great. Maybe a film after that. Okay, so thank you again to the two. I think they deserve a round of applause, both Mary and Mary Savage. The next speaker for this evening is MEP Mairead McGuinness, and we're delighted Mairead is here with us this evening. Mairead was first elected to the European Parliament in 2004 and is its first Vice President. She represents the Midlands and the North West constituency. As first Vice President, she oversees relations with national parliaments and also is responsible for dialogue with religious and non-confessional organisations. Mairead is a member of the Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Development Committee, the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety Committee, and the Constitutional Affairs Committee. You're a busy woman, Mairead, with all those committees. Prior to becoming an MEP, she was a well-known journalist and broadcaster and commentator on RTE. Mairead is from County Louth, but she lives in Meath with her husband and 4 children. So I'm delighted to ask Mairead to come to the platform.
Good evening, everyone. It's a real honour to be here. And before I do the formalities, I have to say that I found those 2 speeches very, very moving. Very, very moving. And in a way, you can read about things, but the spoken word from family members is extraordinarily powerful. And thank you both for giving that very powerful story. So I'm really delighted to be here. It is such an honour to see such a full room. Thank you to the Cathaoirleach for, I thought, beautiful words of welcome, particularly to all of the elected representatives in this gathering, but very especially the Reynolds family, the very extended Reynolds family and friends. And the people of Leitrim who, I mean, this turnout speaks for itself. And I think what you said, Mary, that, Leitrim people look after each other. And I think, you do. And that is fantastic, and never lose that. And I'll say more about that in a brief moment, if I may. I suppose the second thing that strikes me is that the times that woman lived in and what she lived through, we're only trying to imagine what it was like. We really have no idea. And again, she was very brave, obviously. She had a lot of commitments. She had incredible grief to lose her husband. And then to allow her name go forward, many a person would shrink back and move away from public life and public service. But the fact that she did not do that speaks to an incredible person with incredible inner strength and great spirituality and a lot of values. And I think that the country is obviously better for that, and this county is better for the fact that she wasn't selfish and that she stepped forward. I don't know how elections were fought in those days, but my goodness, to fight so many. I gather they were even more passionate than they are today, and maybe we need more passion, and we need people making speeches outside churches and rising the roof and believing in this country and in this county. But I'm trying to even, try to imagine what she would have said and how she would have said it. What I cannot get my head around is how she did it. Not only the work of a public representative and her great service to people, but the distances she would have had to travel, how she would keep connected, keep her feet on the ground, or, as indeed I often did myself, her ear to the ground, which was so important. Thank God you didn't forget. But that is so important if you are a public representative. And she did all of that. And then the tragedy of her sons, which again I knew of but never heard the detail of, and how she worried about their end moments and how she needed to find peace around that. And I think she would be very proud of you both. And I think she must be proud, and I hope she is part of tonight, and I think she is. Her spirit is here. You can kind of sense that. And that she is well remembered and hugely respected, and that we want to hold on to what she did. And in a sense, this gathering is important. We're talking about votes for women and how we're marking that, but this is actually much more important about honouring this great woman. And great public representative who probably did not think of herself as extraordinary. In fact, I would imagine she, from what I've now listened to the detail of her life, would have regarded herself as just one of the people with a job to do. I have a big handbag. It's a thing that you need if you're a woman politician. Mine is not full of cigarettes, I have to say. I love that story. I just love that story. What would she think of today, where you can't even smoke in the environments of a hospital? And rightly so, of course. But in those days, a cigarette was a comfort. And that's why she had them in that handbag of hers. And I love that she went about visiting sick people. I love that she cared for that young mother-to-be or with the child, and how she recorded and was disgusted by the harshness of what she encountered, and how she would have understood how that young woman would have felt. I love her humanity. And I'm glad that in those days there were people with humanity, because I think sometimes when we look to our past, we presume that Ireland was always harsh on issues. But actually it wasn't. I mean, there were individuals who were warm and supportive and kind and very loving to those who were in need. You know, my grandmother was not a politician. One of them I knew and the other I did not. But from what I've learnt of them, they too were great women and very strong. My mother was a very strong woman. And I mean, I'm glad in a way that values are being discussed tonight, because I love what you said about feeding somebody in need. My mother had a great relationship with travellers. They lived beside us. And she would never feed us unless they were fed. She would never let them be hungry. And I think to some extent, I hope tonight recognises the silent work of women around Ireland on these issues, because women care. And I think that's hugely important to say. And it is lovely that tonight we can acknowledge that care. In one sense, I think I shouldn't be here because I have not struggled in the way that the Deputy Reynolds, and I want to give her title because women don't often get their titles, because she struggled much more than I did. But I'm happy to walk in her footsteps, to be a public representative in this country and a member of the European Parliament. And I think that the idea of service is really important. But I think what's much more important for me, and I suppose my work is away in Brussels and Strasbourg, but my roots are here. And my work is for people here, whether it's in Leitrim or Louth or Longford or Galway or Mayo, Roscommon, Sligo, Laois, Offaly, I'm leaving one out, Cavan, Monaghan. Wherever in those 15 counties, I stay connected. And that's why you'll see a little bit of dark shadows under my eyes, because we had a very, I came back from Brussels last night around 5:30, and we had a meeting with the Meath Chamber. Commissioner Phil Hogan was with us. And it was a really good night of celebration for what was happening in County Meath. But this morning there was an event in Letterkenny where we had a very big meeting for business and community groups around Brexit. And the Taoiseach Simon Coveney and Minister Joe McHugh were there. So we took to the roads at 6:10 this morning, Emer and I. And Emer is another great woman, because